So second graders, you've been preparing really for a couple of years for this night, for this day where you get to make your first Holy Communion. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about our readings tonight. You know, Jesus says, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood will live forever. So does that mean that we're going to live to be like 999 years old or something? I don't think so. So what do you think he means when he says live forever? What does Jesus mean? Yes? I think that's exactly right. I think you're exactly right. That we'll live forever with him in heaven. I think that's exactly right. So one of the things that I heard a few years ago from Father, he was then Father Robert Barron, now he's Bishop Robert Barron. He said that the Eucharist is the food and drink that effectively, he uses this phrase, eternalizes us. Eternalizes us. In other words, makes it possible for us to live forever in heaven, to live in eternity. You know, we call this bread heavenly bread. There's a beautiful song called Bread of Heaven. There's another song that we're going to hear tonight, I believe. Are y'all doing Panis Angelicus tonight, choir? Good. We're going to do Panis Angelicus, the song tonight. Do y'all know what that means? And that's a Latin word. I know y'all are studying Latin. So do you know what Panis Angelicus is? Means bread of angels. Bread of angels. Your parents could have helped you with that one, but I'm not sure. So, you know, this Eucharist that we celebrate, we believe it's bread that's come down from heaven. Jesus says that this bread is not like the bread of manna that was similar, because he said people ate the bread of manna and they actually died. And it's interesting what Moses says to the people. That he says, man does not live on bread alone. Did you hear the rest of that phrase? Man does not live on bread alone, said Moses to the people in the first reading. But what does man live on? Do you know? Parents, you want to help them? Man does not live on bread alone. I bet Brian can help you since he did the reading. So does anybody know? Every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. So that's why if you're going to be ready to receive communion, you actually have to listen to the Word of God. Because the Word of God prepares us for the Word made flesh. Jesus was the Word made flesh. And that's what we receive in communion. We receive the Word made flesh. You know, one of the things that I think that the Eucharist does is it equips us to live the divine life. It makes it possible for us to live in eternity, and that we have to be adapted to that. If we just live a regular earthly life, where we live selfishly and we don't really care about people, we don't really try to help others, we just kind of live for ourselves. If we just live here an earthly life, then we're not really adapted and prepared for heaven. So what the Eucharist does is it prepares us, adapts us, equips us for heaven. And so I wanted to think a little bit with you about how different things adapt themselves to their environment. Now y'all study science a little bit, so you know how plants and animals adapt themselves over like thousands of years to their environment. Plants and animals do that. Think about this. Do any of y'all like to go to the beach? Any of y'all like to go to the beach? Beach is a beautiful, wonderful place. If you want to go snorkeling or scuba diving, then you have to have special equipment, right? Scuba diving helps you to go deep and to stay deep. And if you want to go really deep, you have to get on one of those huge diving suits or one of those neat little submarines and go down in a submarine. You have to be adapted and equipped to be able to go deep. Or, I don't know if you watched just recently, but we shot a rocket ship into space. Did y'all see that? I've got to watch that launch. That was pretty cool, wasn't it? And so these two men were launched from the United States down in Florida up into space. I was real fascinated by their spacesuits. They looked a lot different than the ones that I remember back from 20, 30 years ago. But to go into space, especially if you're going to do a spacewalk, or if you're going to do something like walk on the moon, you have to be adapted and equipped to do that, don't you? You got to have a special suit to be able to do that. Otherwise, you die immediately. Think about it. I want to share a simple example with you. When I went to seminary, I studied in Italy. I was in an Italian congregation, a religious order that I studied with. There were about 60% Italians and then a smattering of Americans and Canadians and Argentinians who were in the seminary. Now, I never knew and understood that that living in another country that culture was so different. The way people talked, the way people interacted with each other, their gestures were so different than ours. Now, some of you who are from a foreign country know how that is. You know how different it is to live in a different culture. Well, Italians have a completely different, and some of y'all have Italian descent, so you already know some of this. But Italians have a completely different sense of personal space. Like right here, you got about 5 people in your pew. Well, for Italians, that's enough room for at least 10. They would easily fit 10 on, feel very comfortable. When Italians talk to each other, they're about this far from each other, like 3 or 4 inches. Like for them to talk 6 feet away from somebody is almost impossible for them to be able to do that. And so they will talk to you, and they will literally put their arm around you and talk to you with their face this close to you. That's one of the reasons why COVID-19 was really so terrible in Italy, because they had no sense of personal space. They had to literally quarantine and lock down the whole country in order to keep that virus from continuing to spread. When I got to Italy, that was so weird. It's so difficult for me. This sense of personal space. And a lot of Americans never adapted. I learned to really actually enjoy it. When an Italian greets you, they kiss you on both cheeks. They don't shake your hand. I know, most Americans are like, please, This is when they first meet you, not after they get to know you and love you. Also, when they do a strange thing, when they say goodbye, when we say goodbye, what kind of gesture do we make with our hands? And when we say bye-bye, what do we say? We do like that, right? Bye-bye. So when we want to tell somebody to come here, what do we do? What do we do with our hands? We say, right? Come here, right? So Italians, when they say goodbye, you know how they do it? They do it like this. And so the first few times that an Italian did this to me, I started walking up to them to see what they wanted. And they were like, I'm saying goodbye to you. Why are you so stupid? So anyway, we learn to adapt. And sometimes we have to be equipped to live in a different environment. Guess what? Eternity is a completely different environment than this world. Jesus wants to equip us and to adapt us to eternity. So he gives us this special gift, the Eucharist, his body and blood. And you notice what he says. He says, one of the things he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. That's a pretty radical statement for Jesus to make. And so for us to turn our back on the Eucharist is to turn our back on heaven. Jesus says, and when he says that, how did everybody react? Everybody reacted like, well, that's disgusting. How is that possible? How can that be? And Jesus didn't say, well, I'm only talking symbolically. Jesus says, no. Unless you feed on me, he says. And the verb that he uses there actually means to chew or to munch. So Jesus says, my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. Now, we don't understand exactly how that happens. We don't understand transubstantiation. We only understand it by faith. We believe it by faith. We believe the Word of God. When Jesus says, this is my body and this is my blood, then we believe it. So second graders, today, you're going to be given this gift from Jesus himself. It is Jesus that is going to be present on the altar. It is Jesus himself acting through the priest that gives himself to you. What he's sharing with us is his divine life, his flesh and blood. And as Jesus says, unless you eat my flesh, or he says, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in him. You know, Jesus is drawing us into the great gift of his divine life, of his love, his perfect love. His perfect love which was shown on the cross. And so what we celebrate on this altar is the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, made present through this sacrament of the Eucharist. This is the most precious gift that we have as Catholics. And we're so happy that we can celebrate with this first communion with you today. You know, our bodies, our minds, our hearts have to be adapted and equipped for eternity. We want to live forever in heaven with God, right? This is the food that makes that possible. This is what nourishes it and it makes it possible. It makes it possible for us to go into the depths with Jesus. It makes it possible for us to live in that rarefied air of heaven. It makes it possible for us to live like Jesus lived. So I really encourage you today, open your hearts to what Jesus wants to give you. And I just pray for all of us. I pray for all of us, everybody here, that we'll have the same joy and anticipation that you second graders have today. Every time that you receive the communion and every time we receive communion, that you'll have that same kind of joy and joyful anticipation that God gives you today.